Today I want to show you how to knit a blanket design that I have named Riley. This is probably one of the simplest blankets you can knit. It's just a 12-row repeat, and of those 12 rows, 10 rows are just rows where you knit all the way across. This blanket's perfect when life gets busy and you don't want to have to think when you knit at the end of the day or whenever you choose to knit, and you just want to be able to pick up and put down your project whenever you get that spare 5 minutes to knit. My sample blanket is about 60 centimeters wide and 80 centimeters long, and if you're wanting to replicate my sample blanket, you're going to need 400 grams of double knit yarn. If you're not in the UK, an equivalent weight would be 3-weight yarn or light worsted weight yarn. You are also going to need some 4mm circular knitting needles. You want those needles to be about 100 centimeters long. Longer is fine, but any shorter and you're going to find that your stitches don't fit comfortably on your needles. You are also going to need some embroidery scissors and some tapestry needles for sorting out your ends when you change ball. And then last but definitely not least, you are going to need 2 stitch markers, and we use those to mark where our side borders start and end, and it just makes knitting that middle textured panel so much easier. The beauty with this pattern is there is no pattern multiple, so you don't have to worry how many or how little stitches you cast on. You can just cast on until you're roughly happy with the width that you want your blanket to be. That being said, if you want to replicate my blanket, I cast on a total of 137 stitches. So if you're using the same weight yarn that I did and you're wanting to replicate that width of my sample blanket, you're going to want to cast on 137 stitches. I'm just going to cast on a small sample for this video, and as always I'm going to be using the long tail cast on, but if you have a cast on method that you prefer, please feel free to use it. It will still work with the pattern. This blanket's knitted all in one piece from bottom to top, which means the first section of the blanket that we need to tackle is the bottom garter stitch border. That consists of 15 rows worked in exactly the same way, so I'm going to walk you through how to work row 1, and then I'm going to leave you to carry on and work rows 2 to 15 by yourself. First things first, as the border is garter stitch, it's really nice and simple to work. There is actually only one stitch in the row that is not a knit stitch, and that is the final stitch of each row, and that is our selvage stitch, which we work slightly differently to give us a really nice neat edge up the long sides of our blanket. So to start row 1 of your border, you are going to knit your way across your row, and you are going to knit every single stitch until you have one stitch left to work in the row, and that will be when you have one stitch left on your left hand needle. This final stitch in the row we are going to slip purlwise with the yarn in front. So the first step that you need to take when working this final stitch is to get your working yarn to the front of your work. You can either do this by lifting your working yarn all the way to the front of your work, or if like me you're a continental knitter, you can pick up and hold that working yarn with your right hand needle, and then at the end of the technique you just lift it over your needle to get it forward. To slip the stitch, you are going to slip it purlwise, and that means you are going to go into your stitch from right through to left, so as if you were going to work a purl stitch, so not from left to right but from right through to left. Slide it onto your right hand needle, and when you're confident that it's there nice and securely, you can take your left hand needle out. And then, just as I mentioned a moment ago, as I've held this working yarn, I'm going to lift it over and make sure that it's very definitely at the front of my work, because if I don't and I left it there and I turned and carried on knitting, I would be increasing my row by 1 stitch each time I did that, and we don't want to do that because we want a nice rectangular blanket. So that's row 1 of 15. I'm now going to leave you to carry on and work rows 2 to 15 by yourself, and I will rejoin you at the end of row 15 and walk you through how to tackle that middle textured panel that forms the bulk of our blanket. Now that our bottom garter stitch border is done, we're ready to jump into the 12-row repeat that forms the bulk of our blanket. I'm going to walk you through each row one by one, and then I'll explain to you how you grow your blanket. The first time we work row 1, we're going to do a little bit of setup work just to get our stitch markers in place, but every subsequent time you go back to work a row 1, you're just going to slip your markers instead of placing them. So start that first row, row 1, by knitting 9 stitches. Then you're going to grab the first of your 2 stitch markers and pop it onto your right hand needle. Next, you're going to knit your way across your row until 9 stitches before the end of the row, and that will be when you have 9 stitches left to work on this left hand needle. When you reach that point, you are going to get the second of your 2 stitch markers and again just pop it onto your right hand needle. Then you're going to carry on and knit 8 more stitches. That should leave you with just one final stitch to work, and just like with our border, we are going to slip that stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 2 starts by knitting the first 9 stitches, and this is a good point to check that you have your stitch marker in the right place, because after that 9th stitch you should come across your first stitch marker. Slip the marker over from your left needle to your right needle, and then you are going to purl all the stitches until you get to your next stitch marker. So just purl every single stitch until you hit your second stitch marker. When you get to that second marker, you're going to slip it over from one needle to the next, and then you're going to carry on and knit 8 stitches. Finish off your row by slipping that final stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 3 is nice and simple. You are going to knit every single stitch in the row with the exception of that final stitch. You're going to slip your stitch markers over from one needle to the next as you get to them, and then when you do get to that final stitch in the row, you're going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 4 starts again with knitting the first 9 stitches. That should take you to your first marker, and again you're going to slip it over from your left needle to your right needle, and then just like with row 2, you are going to purl all the stitches until you hit that second marker. So all the stitches between the 2 markers are purl stitches. Rows 5 up to and including row 12 are all worked in the same way, which is what makes this blanket so nice and easy. So just like with your bottom garter stitch border, you are going to knit your way all the way across each of those rows. You are going to slip your stitch markers when you get to them, and then when you get to that final stitch in the row, you're going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front. And you are going to do that for rows 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 and 12. So all those rows are identical. So I'm going to leave you to carry on and work those rows, and I will do the same, and then I will join you at the end of row 12 to talk you through how you grow the rest of your blanket. So this is what a finished 12 row repeat looks like, and you're going to use these 12 rows as the building blocks for your blanket. So after you finish a row 12, you go back to row 1 and repeat the process, and so on and so forth. If you're wanting to replicate my sample blanket, you are going to want to repeat rows 1 to 12 a total of 23 times. That is including this first set, so you would now go away and repeat rows 1 to 12 a further 22 times. What you will notice as you grow your blanket is every time you work an odd numbered row, you are going to have the right side of your work facing up at you. Once you have worked the number of repeats that you want to work, to get symmetry top and bottom of our blanket, you are going to work rows 1 to 5 from the repeat before you move on to that top garter stitch border. What that does is give you these sections of stockinette top and bottom, and you don't end up with a lopsided border, which is what would happen if you went straight on to working your garter stitch border after finishing a row 12. So I will now go away and work rows 1 to 5 once more just to show you what I mean, and then I'll rejoin you at the end of row 5 to show you how we add that top garter stitch border. After you've worked those 5 rows once more, you should have something that is obviously a lot bigger than this sample, but that has a stockinette section after the bottom garter stitch border, and then a matching stockinette section just before you start your top garter stitch border. So that means that the first row of your top border should be a wrong side row, and what that means is when you start your row, you will have the wrong side of your work facing up at you, so the opposite side to this side. Just like the bottom garter stitch border, the top garter stitch border consists of 15 rows worked in exactly the same way. I will walk you through row 1 and then again I will leave you to carry on rows 2 to 15 by yourself. So just like with our bottom garter stitch border, every stitch with the exception of the final stitch is a knit stitch, and as you knit your way across this first row of your top border, you can remove your stitch markers as you come to them because we don't need to mark those side borders anymore. So when you reach a stitch marker, instead of slipping it over, you're just going to take it off and pop it to one side. But aside from that, you carry on and knit your way across your row until you have one stitch left to work, and that will be when you have one stitch left on this left hand needle. Just like with the last stitch in every row so far in this blanket, the final stitch of each border row you are going to slip purlwise with your yarn in front. So there we go, that's the first of 15 rows completed. If you now go away and complete rows 2 to 15 by yourself, I will then rejoin you to show you how we cast off and get this from a work in progress on our needles to a finished item that you can gift. The final row of any knitted project is your cast off, and for my blankets I like to use a nice simple knitted cast off. It's nice and easy to do and it looks really good as well. I'm going to walk you through the first few stitches and then leave you to carry on and cast off the rest of your row yourself. If you need a more in-depth tutorial as to how to work the knitted cast off, I've got a separate tutorial that covers it in really simple, nice and easy steps, and I'll link that here for you now. But for the purpose of this video, I'm just going to go over the basics of the first few stitches. To start your cast off, you want to knit the first 2 stitches. When you knit these stitches, you want to make sure that you don't knit them too tight, because otherwise when you work your cast off, your stitches will not be loose enough to allow your work to lay nice and flat and the top edge will tug inwards. Once you've knitted those first 2 stitches, you are going to grab your left hand needle and pop it into the first of the 2 stitches from left through to right. Then you're going to hold the other stitch on the needle with your index finger, and you're going to use this left hand needle to lift that stitch up, over and completely off your needle. So you go from 2 stitches on this right hand needle down to 1. Then you're going to knit 1 more stitch so that you go back up to 2 stitches on that right hand needle, and then you're going to repeat that same process again. Pop your left hand needle in the first of the 2 stitches from left through to right, hold the second stitch and then lift that stitch up and over and off your needle. And you're going to repeat that process of knitting 1 and lifting 1 all the way to the end of the row, and I will rejoin you when you have no stitches left on this left hand needle and just 1 final stitch left on this right hand needle. Once you reach this point here, you can break your yarn because we don't need to have it attached to the ball anymore. What you do want to do is make sure that you leave yourself a nice amount of tail so that you've got enough to sew in your ends when you're done. And then just one final step that I like to do, I am going to pull with my needle to make this final stitch nice and big, and at that point we can get rid of our needles, we don't need them anymore. Then you're going to pop your finger and thumb through that loop and grab the tail. Pull the tail all the way through so that it's coming through the loop like that, and then you're going to pull and give it a nice tug to tighten it right up, and then when you sew in your tail you get a lovely neat corner. Just a couple of final bits and bobs before I leave you to your knitting. I always get asked if a pattern is reversible, and in the case of Riley, like with many patterns that have stockinette stitch, no, it's not a reversible pattern. If I flip it over, you can see the wrong side is not ugly in any way, it is just plain and does not have that same defined texture that the right side has. As with all my blankets, I have a free version of the written pattern on my blog that I've linked in the description for you, and there's also a link there to buy an ad-free PDF for a small fee if you're somebody that would prefer to have something to print off and take away with you rather than having to rely on your tech to view the pattern. I also get asked if my patterns can be knitted in a different weight of yarn to the one that I use, and the answer is yes. You're just going to need to adjust the amount of stitches that you cast on and the number of repeats that you work. So if you're using a thicker yarn than the one I've used, you are going to need to cast on less stitches and work less repeats. And if you're using a thinner yarn than the one I've chosen, you're going to need to cast on more stitches and work more repeats. Just have a play and see what size and how many stitches you need to cast on. When it comes to choosing your knitting needles, just make sure that you are using the right size needles for the yarn you are using, and your ball band will guide you as to what size needles you need to use. All that's left for me to do now is to leave you with another piece of knitting inspiration, and I will see you for another video again soon.